In 1976, a young student at MIT sat hunched over a terminal, working on a PhD thesis that must have seemed almost sci-fi at the time. The topic wasn't engineering or physics, but something far more prophetic. The power of the computer in the art of political communication. There was no social media back then, no 24-hour news cycle. Most people view computers as giant calculators. But this student, a man who would go on to become one of the most influential and polarizing world leaders of our era, understood a chilling secret early on. You don't need to ban the truth if you can simply drown it out. This was the quiet birth of what experts are now calling the new censorship. It doesn't look like secret police smashing printing presses in the dead of night. Instead, it wears the mask of democracy. It is sophisticated, weaponizing terms like freedom and the people to erode the very foundations of the press from the inside out. Today, authoritarian leaders don't always silence journalists with a gavel. They do it by labeling them prostitutes, anti-patriots, or monsters, until a wave of orchestrated online rage does the job for them. The results of this shift are as effective as they are unsettling. We see the statistics. More journalists killed in Gaza in the last year than in both world wars and the Vietnam War combined. And yet, the reaction from the public is often a detached shrug. Even in the heart of London, at the House of Journalists, a sanctuary for those fleeing despotic regimes, the irony is thick. These survivors, who risked everything for the truth, find themselves expected to perform their trauma for donors, turning their life and death struggles into polished, lyrical stories for a comfortable audience. It leads to a bizarre and urgent contradiction. We live in the most connected era in human history, yet our blind spots are growing larger by the day. Why is it that the more information we have, the less we actually seem to know? And if the tools of democracy are being used to dismantle the truth, what happens when the last person asking the difficult questions finally falls silent?
In the suffocating, humid air of a South Delhi apartment, a veteran investigative reporter named Ananya sat bathed in the harsh blue light of her laptop screen. It was past 2 a.m.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and the ceiling fan was ticking rhythmically overhead, but she couldn't even hear it over the rapid-fire vibration of her phone against the wooden desk.
So this is it, right? This is the modern midnight knock at the door.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the mechanism of her silencing hadn't arrived with a literal knock or the splintering of her front door or some government warrant. It arrived as a heavily pixelated, low-resolution meme injected into her housing society's WhatsApp group.
A completely mundane digital space, literally a group chat normally reserved for, complaining about parking spaces or coordinating plumbing repairs.
Precisely that space. Ananya watched the little green typing bubbles just multiply. Her neighbors, these are people she had shared mangoes with during the summer monsoons for over a decade, they were eagerly forwarding it a doctored video.
Chilling.
The crudely edited footage claims she was a covert operative on the payroll of an enemy state. And within hours, her phone was vibrating with thousands of bot-generated death threats.
Thousands of them.
Yeah, thousands. And the psychological cruelty of the architecture was just so apparent in the details. The threats weren't generic. They actually used her mother's maiden name. They referenced the exact school her nephew attended.
I really want to examine the mechanics of that vulnerability for a second because it represents a fundamental shift in how power actually operates. Traditional censorship, like the classic image of a dictator banning a newspaper or jailing a reporter, it's a highly visible exertion of state power.
Right, it draws international condemnation.
Exactly. But what Ananya experienced in South Delhi, it's basically the privatization of violence. The state doesn't even have to touch her. It just has to signal to the public that she is no longer protected by the social contract.
And when you look at the academic frameworks detailing this new censorship, they identify this exact shift. Authoritarianism has learned to masquerade as, radical democracy.
Yeah, playing the populist card.
The state positions itself not as the suppressor of information, but as the protector of the people against a corrupt elitist press. By the time Ananya walked down to her local market the next day, the grocer she had known for 15 years just looked firmly at his shoes.
He wouldn't even meet her eye.
No, he wouldn't. The environment had been so thoroughly saturated with manufactured loathing that her very existence in public felt like an act of treason. The state hadn't officially questioned her yet, but they didn't need to.
The public had already held the trial.
Right, delivered the verdict, and was eagerly carrying out the psychological execution. It's highly effective, just looking at this purely from a mechanical standpoint, of course.
If we look at how a biological organism defends itself, investigative journalism basically operates as the immune system of a democratic society. Yeah, like its entire biological function is to detect pathogens' corruption, the abuse of state power, systemic decay, and neutralize them by bringing them to light.
And under the old model of censorship, the pathogen just tries to destroy the immune system directly.
Right. But a direct attack on the immune system triggers a massive systemic alarm. The body knows it is under attack. The international community knows it. What we are seeing with this deep dive into new censorship is the intentional induction of an autoimmune disease.
Ooh, see that.
Well, the state, acting as the pathogen, doesn't attack the white blood cells. Instead, it alters the chemical signaling of the body. It floods the system with so much disinformation and contradictory noise that the body just becomes utterly confused. It convinces the surrounding tissue, the citizens, the neighbors in the WhatsApp group, that the white blood cells keeping them healthy are actually invasive parasites. And then the state simply steps back and watches the society tear its own defenses to pieces.
And the linguistic engineering used to trigger that autoimmune response is remarkably consistent globally. Yeah. It relies on culturally tailored, like highly emotionally charged slurs designed to bypass rational analysis and directly trigger disgust.
Give me some examples of that.
Well, in India and the Philippines, the systematic label applied to dissenting reporters is prostitutes.
Wow, which is just a masterclass in psychological manipulation. By fusing press and prostitute, you aren't just accusing a journalist of bias, you are attacking their fundamental moral architecture.
Exactly. Especially in deeply conservative patriarchal societies.
Right. Applying that term especially to female journalists like Ananya strips them of all societal respect. It frames their reporting not as journalism, but as an act of moral degradation sold to the highest bidder.
It completely delegitimizes the messenger, so the message never even has to be addressed. And we see this exact architecture elsewhere. In Germany, populist movements have resurrected the term Lügenpresse, which means the lying press. In South Korea, reporters asking difficult questions about state policy are branded pro-Japanese anti-patriots, which is a calculated strike at a deeply sensitive generational historical nerve.
Specific.
And in Israel, researchers tracking this media phenomenon have documented an environment where journalists are routinely described by their own citizens as bloodthirsty monsters or lefty Jew haters.
Okay, I have to challenge the premise here a bit, though. I understand the framework, but I struggle with the idea that this is entirely a new, meticulously engineered strategy.
So,
well, I mean, human beings are inherently tribal, right? We've always formed mobs. We've always burned witches and chased out heretics based on rumors. Isn't it a bit of a stretch to call this a sophisticated architecture?
I get what you're saying.
Aren't we just looking at standard human psychology amplified by the speed of smartphones?
It is absolutely true that the raw material human tribalism, anxiety, and the propensity for mob violence has always existed. But what distinguishes the new censorship from historical witch hunts is the deliberate industrialized optimization of those impulses. A mob with pitchforks is organic and chaotic. The systematic deployment of bot networks to drop a specific emotionally calibrated narrative into thousands of localized WhatsApp groups simultaneously is not organic. It requires an architect.
Right, it doesn't just happen by accident.
No, it requires someone who looks at the chaotic landscape of human communication and sees a data problem to be solved. And to trace the origins of that engineering mindset, we have to look away from modern Silicon Valley and travel back to 1976.
Wait, 1976?
Yeah, to the narrow, humming computer labs of MIT.
A time when computers took up entire rooms, reading data off perforated punch cards. And Benjamin Netanyahu is walking those halls. His peers are likely debating, the philosophical ethics of the Cold War or the physics of nuclear deterrence.
But he is focused on political communication. And he isn't looking at it through the lens of Enlightenment ideals, the writings of Locke or Rousseau, or the civic duty of a free press. He is analyzing political communication purely as an engineering constraint.
Because in the 1970s, the traditional media basically functioned as an insurmountable gatekeeper, right?
Exactly. If a politician wanted to reach the masses, they were forced to submit their message to editors, seasoned journalists, and television anchors. Those figures held the power to filter, fact-check, provide counter-arguments, and contextualize the political rhetoric before it ever reached the citizen.
Which, if you are an ambitious political figure who views the public not as partners in governance, but as variables to be managed, is a highly inefficient system. You have to pass your message through an intellectual filter that you literally do not control.
And his solution to that inefficiency is extensively documented in his 1976 thesis at the Sloan School of Management, co-authored with Ziad Zur. It was titled Computerization in the Newspaper Industry.
Sounds like a real page-turner.
Right. But when analysts examine the granular details of that thesis today, it reads like a blueprint for the modern digital era. He wasn't writing about politics at all. He was laser-focused on the technical mechanisms of data compression, hierarchical database management, and the distributed processing of information.
Let me stop you there, because the leap from database management to the erosion of the free press requires some explanation. I mean, in 1976, a database was essentially just a digital filing cabinet. How did he connect that to political power?
By recognizing that whoever controlled the velocity and retrieval of data controlled the perception of reality. He and Zur concluded that computerization would radically enhance political power.
Just by making things faster.
Basically, by providing massive data banks capable of compiling and disseminating information on highly specific issues and demographics at an unprecedented rate. He understood that news didn't have to be a static, printed object delivered once a day. If you could digitize information, you could make it modular. You could retrieve it instantly, repackage it, and bypass the rigid traditional sequences of how news was produced and distributed.
He saw that if you build a wall of noise that travels faster than the printing press, you don't actually have to ban the printing press. The newspaper simply becomes irrelevant because it is too slow.
And that MIT Engineering Foundation was immediately hybridized with elite American corporate strategy. Following his time at MIT, he went to work for the Boston Consulting Group.
Oh, BCG.
He was working in the same environment as figures like Mitt Romney during a period when corporate consulting was completely revolutionizing how businesses understood markets.
In the late 70s, BCG was famous for frameworks like the growth share matrix. They were pioneering the whole concept of market segmentation.
Exactly. You don't just sell a product to the public.
Right. You divide the public into highly specific psychological and economic demographics, and you tailor a distinct, highly optimized message to each segment. If you take the mathematical precision of MIT database architecture and combine it with the aggressive, market-driven strategies of corporate consulting, you have a terrifying toolkit.
You have the exact mechanism of modern populist communication. You segment the voting populace just as a corporation segments consumers. You identify the specific anxieties, historical grievances, and cultural triggers of each demographic.
And then you just hammer them with it.
You utilize high-velocity digital networks to deliver customized, emotionally resonant narratives directly to them, completely bypassing the journalistic gatekeepers who would otherwise scrutinize the claims.
It's the weaponization of marketing. You don't waste resources trying to persuade the demographic that fundamentally opposes you.
Efficient.
You identify the demographics most susceptible to fear, and you flood their specific channels, their WhatsApp groups, their Facebook feeds, with a constant optimized stream of perceived threats. But an architect of this caliber doesn't just utilize these tools for domestic election. If this architecture works on a local grocer in South Delhi, the logical progression is to scale it up to manage international superpowers.
Which brings us to the geopolitical application of this strategy. How does a leader utilize narrative architecture to manage a primary ally, particularly a superpower like the United States?
Well, the traditional orthodox approach is diplomacy. You work through the State Department, you hold summits, you respect the established bureaucratic channels.
And you attempt to maintain a broad bipartisan consensus for your nation's security.
But the traditional approach involves gatekeepers. It involves career diplomats, intelligence analysts, and foreign policy experts who might push back against your agenda. So, if the MIT and BCG toolkit teaches you to bypass gatekeepers, you don't talk to the State Department.
No, you talk directly to the American public. Or, more accurately, you segment the American public and talk directly to the demographic most primed to receive your specific narrative.
Which is exactly the playbook utilized over the subsequent decades. The strategy deliberately bypassed traditional diplomatic neutrality and embedded itself deeply within a specific faction of the American political landscape.
The conservative establishment, right-wing media ecosystems, and the evangelical Christian base. The narrative was meticulously crafted for this specific market segment.
Stripping away all the nuance.
Exactly. Geopolitical complexities and territorial disputes were stripped of their nuance and repackaged as an existential biblical struggle. The conflicts of the Middle East were framed to the American conservative base not as distant foreign policy issues, but as the absolute frontline defense of Western civilization against radical Islam.
Let's break down the underlying philosophies clashing here, because this isn't just about different marketing strategies. It represents a fundamental collision of worldviews. On one side, you have the Hobbesian worldview.
Right, Thomas Hobbes.
Yeah, Hobbes argued that the natural state of humanity is essentially a state of war nasty, brutish, and short. Therefore, the only way to ensure survival is through overwhelming strength.
A very bleak outlook.
Very. In international relations, a Hobbesian approach dictates that the world is inherently dangerous. International law is mostly a polite fiction, and security must be achieved by any means necessary. A state must be a leviathan, unapologetic, militarized, and prioritizing its own survival above all international norms.
And that Hobbesian narrative resonates deeply with the specific segment of the American electorate that views the world through a lens of absolute right and wrong, good and evil.
Right, a very binary perspective.
Contrast that with the liberal cosmopolitan worldview, which has traditionally underpinned international institutions and the American progressive movement. This philosophy argues that true security cannot be achieved through perpetual military dominance.
It relies on the belief in universal human rights, a rules-based international order, diplomacy, and mutual cooperation.
Those two worldviews are mechanically incompatible. If you fully commit your narrative architecture to feeding the Hobbesian fears of the political right to secure immediate backing, you are inevitably going to alienate the liberal cosmopolitan left.
It's the geopolitical equivalent of burning the furniture to heat the house. You are freezing in the immediate present. Your political survival is on the line. So you take the mahogany dining table, representing decades of careful, bipartisan diplomatic alliances, and you literally throw it into the fireplace.
The fire provides immense immediate warmth. You mobilize a passionate base. You secure short-term military funding and diplomatic cover. You create a deeply loyal faction that will defend your actions unequivocally.
But when the morning comes, you don't have a table. And 10 years later, the structural integrity of the house is compromised. By leaning so heavily into one partisan narrative, you fracture the special relationship that previously existed above party lines.
And the demographic data tracking this fracture is just stark. We observe a deep, historically unprecedented divide within the Jewish American community and the broader American electorate.
The younger demographics, right?
Yes. Younger demographics, raised in an era of digital interconnectedness and highly attuned to the liberal cosmopolitan worldview, increasingly process geopolitical conflict through the lens of anti-colonialism, human rights, and social justice.
Which is causing immense friction.
This ideological friction is the direct engine of the campus protests spreading across the United States, and it provides the momentum for movements like boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The long-term bipartisan consensus was basically sacrificed for short-term narrative dominance.
And while that international polarization is happening, the leader is also utilizing external conflict to manage the domestic population. In political science, there is a well-documented mechanism known as the rally around the flag effect.
Absolutely. It is one of the most reliable phenomena in political mechanics. When a populace perceives a severe existential external threat, their natural psychological response is to seek security by unifying behind the executive leadership.
The threshold for criticizing the government just rises dramatically.
Right. If the house is actively on fire, you don't argue with the fire chief about his accounting practices, you just let him hold the hose.
So if a leader is facing severe domestic vulnerability, say massive public protests over controversial judicial overhauls or looming criminal corruption trials that threaten their freedom, the most effective way to neutralize that domestic threat is to elevate an external one.
By focusing the narrative architecture entirely on a looming foreign menace, such as the Iranian nuclear program or regional adversaries, the executive can consolidate unitary power, justify massive defense expenditures, and completely drown out domestic political opposition.
It's just overwhelming noise.
Yes. The population simply lacks the cognitive bandwidth to scrutinize democratic erosion at home when they are convinced their physical survival is threatened from abroad. Just to be clear, we're looking at this strictly as an analysis of political mechanics, not passing moral judgment on any specific faction.
Of course. But the mechanisms of this narrative warfare, the strategic utilization of noise, the manipulation of foreign alliances, the weaponization of fear, these are all really high-level political concepts. I want to bring this back down to the ground level.
Back to the journalists.
Right. We started with Ananya in South Delhi, the white blood cell being attacked by the very society she was trying to protect. What happens to the journalists who survive that autoimmune response?
The ones who get out.
The ones who aren't killed, who manage to pack a bag in the middle of the night and cross a border to find sanctuary in the democratic West, because the terrifying reality is that the architecture of control actually follows them.
It does. The tragic irony of the exiled truth teller is explored with just devastating precision in our final source for this deep dive. The narrative centers on a celebrated exile named Elias. Well, he manages to escape a brutal regime that quite literally broke his fingers to stop him from writing. He navigates the perilous journey to London, seeking refuge in an institution specifically designed to protect persecuted writers.
The House of Journalists. But the sanctuary he finds is merely a different, more sophisticated kind of cage. The physical environment of the house is vital to understanding the control mechanism.
Really sets the tone.
It's a drafty, imposing Victorian townhouse. The air smells permanently of damp wool, old coffee, and the lingering anxiety of its inhabitants. These are men and women who were intellectual titans, feared by despots in their home countries.
And now they're reduced to what?
Pacing the creaking floorboards, bickering over who gets the slightly faster internet connection, or desperately trying to catch the eye of a wealthy patron at a cocktail reception.
The bureaucratic architecture of the house mirrors the authoritarian regimes the journalists fled. But the coercion here is economic and aesthetic rather than physical. The central mechanism of control is enforced by the director of the house, a man named Julian Snowman.
The guy running the show.
Yeah. The exiles are provided with physical safety, yes, but that safety is highly conditional. They are required to pay for their sanctuary by performing their trauma for the Western donor class.
It is the ultimate commodification of truth. It's like the entertainment industry treating real-life struggles as content that must be optimized for audience engagement. Elias realizes that he is not valued for his incisive political analysis or his complex humanity.
No, he is valued solely as a prop.
He has to sand down all the rough, unpalatable edges of his actual lived experience. If he drinks himself to sleep to stave off the nightmares of his torture, or if he expresses deep, cynical bitterness about the futility of his own writing, none of that fits the brand.
He is required to conform to a highly polished, lyrical archetype. He basically must play the noble, stoic, persecuted hero.
And the source illustrates this through multiple characters trapped in this NGO industrial complex, right?
Yes. There is Mr. Stan, a journalist who was horrifically physically mutilated by state-sponsored violence. Within the House of Journalists, his mutilation is not treated as a tragedy to be healed, but as an exhibit to be utilized.
Dark.
His physical trauma guarantees donor engagement. And then there is Mustafa, another exiled writer, whom Julian Snowman constantly praises for his lyrical ellipses.
The pauses in his stories, the things he intentionally leaves out.
Exactly. The director loves the poetic, sanitized spaces in Mustafa's retellings of trauma because those spaces appeal to the aesthetic sensibilities of the London literary elite.
It's more digestible.
The actual visceral horror of what Mustafa endured is too grotesque, too real for a comfortable audience sipping wine at a fundraiser. So the truth is filtered.
It is censorship masquerading as philanthropy. The information environment is still being strictly controlled. It's just that the enforcers are no longer secret police with batons. They are well-meaning NGO directors managing the emotional comfort levels of wealthy benefactors.
A truth is only permitted to exist if it has been optimized for audience engagement. It strips the victim of their humanity by demanding they function as content.
And this brings Elias to a profound and shameful realization while standing alone on a freezing London balcony. He looks out over the free city he risked his life to reach, and he understands that he is not truly free.
He is safe from the dictator's prison, but he is fundamentally trapped within a Western humanitarian system that values the polished, consumable story of his suffering far more than it values his actual, complicated, messy freedom.
When we pull back and look at the entire tapestry we've woven today, the threads connect in a way that is chilling in its coherence. The destruction of truth in the modern era does not require the visceral cinematic imagery of fascists burning books in a public square.
It is an outdated model entirely.
The new censorship is an architectural marvel of psychological engineering. We can trace the lineage from the quiet, prophetic calculations of data compression on a 1970s MIT mainframe to the corporate market segmentation of the Boston Consulting Group, all the way to the localized, deeply personal terror of a WhatsApp mob in South Delhi.
And we observe how those same mechanisms of segmentation and emotional manipulation are scaled up to the global stage. They're used to bypass diplomacy, leverage the Hobbesian anxieties of specific voting blocs, and utilize external wars to mask internal democratic decay.
Right. And finally, we see how even the sanctuaries built to protect the truth tellers are infected by the same underlying logic, reducing the horrific reality of authoritarian violence into a sanitized performance for donor capital. The ultimate triumph of the new censorship is not merely the silencing of individual journalists, but the erosion of the very concept of a shared reality. When the architecture of communication inherently favors the loudest, most emotionally manipulative voices over the quiet nuance of truth, a society ceases to function as a unified democracy, fracturing into isolated echo chambers entirely vulnerable to the whims of those who control the noise.